Could I welcome you here this morning? I'm Darren Mitchell and I'm a member of the Battle for Australia New South Wales Association Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to this special occasion on behalf of that committee, and in particular our chair, Group Captain Doug Rosa, who is at the front here and you'll hear from later this morning. In welcoming you here on behalf of the committee to mark in a particularly sobering week, the 75th anniversary of events that were gradually unfolding in 1942. And I don't need to remind anybody in this room about what occurred on the 15th of February that year with the fall of Singapore. But as Prime Minister Curtin and the Australian community in general received and absorbed the news of the fall of Singapore, there are obviously a number of things that begun to be put in motion. And amongst that was the Prime Minister's responsibility to rouse the community and the nation of Australia to resist whatever lay ahead. And he did so on the 16th and 17th of February, and that is why we're meeting today, because in fact overnight he had released a press release where he first coined the phrase that we are now in a battle for
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'd like to start today, of course, by thanking the Battle for Australia Day Committee, and particularly Doug and Darren, for organising the event and giving me the honour of addressing you today. Certainly, historians often feel they live two lives, the one that they currently live through and the one that they currently study, and certainly the Pacific War has been a passion and a hobby of mine for a very long time. I'm very lucky that I took my hobby and interest and turned it into a profession. So many books and over 15 years of archival study later, the more I realise I know about this amazing period about history and the history of the world, is I know less and less as I learn more and more. So there's always more to be written, and I'm certainly looking forward at that point in a few years' time when the Second World War takes on the preeminent role when we get to the 100 years of the Second World War. But I'd like to talk today about the importance of the events that embroiled Australia some 75 years ago. In doing so, I'll touch on some of the well-known and key events of the year, but I spend most of the time weaving a narrative about the totality of this year. Well, whatever I can fit into about the next 30 minutes or so. In doing so, I want to talk about some of the important events of this year that helped transform Australia, not just on the battlefield, but also politically, strategically, and to the nation. I'm going to try and give some context to the attacks on Darwin, to the battles on Kokoda and Milne Bay, as well as trying to put in place how critical 1942 was to the development of Australia as a nation. Let's see if I can get the first part of the technology to work. So I'm sure these are images that everyone is pretty familiar with. These are sort of the more iconic events that happened: the fall of Singapore, the bombing of Darwin, the Mitchell submarine raid on Sydney, and of course the fighting along the Kokoda Trail. 1942 represents the first time that the shadows of war from a great power conflict touched the shores of Australia. The bombing of Darwin and the Japanese air offensive against northern Australia, the attack on Sydney Harbour, and the battles for the air, land and sea approaches to Australia's north occurred within a critical period in Australia's history. As mentioned, this was described by the then Prime Minister John Curtin as the Battle for Australia. It includes the creation of the Southwest Pacific area under US General Douglas Macarthur, the defence of the air and sea approaches to our nation, the mass arrival of US forces in Australia, and the campaigns in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. So the history of Australia in 1942 is most synonymously remembered with the military events of that year, but we need to provide a broad understanding of the events of this year, and that means the coverage has to roam beyond the strict confines of time and location, at times taking in perspectives such as politics and social relations and cultural experience. My plan is to touch on a few of these issues if I can today. As noted, this year was a challenging time for Australia. In the face of a modern great power conflict, the nation had to navigate an unprecedented set of challenges without the support of our traditional protector at the time, the British Empire. In forging a new alliance and setting new directions, Australia very much matured as a nation. The events also helped to cement the role of the Anzac Legend in Australian society. The Anzac Legend, as we know, however, tends to preference World War I and the battles in far-off Turkey, France, Belgium and the Middle East over the events that occurred on our doorstep in the Pacific during 1942 to 45. While the Australian government heartily supported the commemorative activities that was mentioned around the 50th anniversary of the end of the First World War in Second World War, in the 90s, there is questions about the impact and resonance that that campaign had on the broader population. Of course, soon after there was a change of government, and the new Prime Minister, John Howard, took a very different perspective on how he viewed that part of Australia's history. Having had a grandfather who served in the Royal Naval Division at Gallipoli, and with a commitment to the monarchy and devotion to Great Britain, Prime Minister John Howard spent a lot of time shifting the focus of Anzac away from the Second World War and back to the First World War, to the experiences of the Western Front and the landing in Gallipoli. Of course, our current centenary of Anzac has been billed as a time to remember the full expanse of Australia's war experience and its veterans. But unsurprisingly, the campaigns before Federation, as well as those of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the current conflicts in the Middle East, and in the South Pacific in more recent years, have struggled for obvious reasons to compete with the avalanche of remembrance activities around the centenary of the First World War. This has meant that aside from the prisoner of war experience, the only area of the Second World War that has really retained a strong sense of public consciousness is the battles along the Kokoda Trail. Beyond this campaign, 1942 does not deeply resonate with the Australian public at large, although I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here about the importance of that to this particular audience. As such, I'm very glad to see that in 2017, the 75th anniversary of 1942, is being picked up by the Centenary Campaign, by the War Memorial, DDA, the media, and others as an important year of reflection and commemoration of these events. The broader question remains open, however, about how much of a role should 1942 play in the already crowded space of the history of Australia at war. To answer this question is to establish just how important this year is in Australia's history more broadly. And to me, the evidence is irrefutable. 1942 was a pivotal year for Australia, if not the pivotal year in our history. While Gallipoli in 1915 might reverberate as the birthplace of the Anzac Legend, or even for some the birthplace of Australian national identity, it did so in the shadow of Australia's relationship with Great Britain. 1942 is the year which, devoid of this traditional reliance on the British, Australia faced the threat of invasion for the first and only time since European settlement. In response, Australia mobilised, industrialised, fought a number of vital battles, ratified the Statute of Westminster, forged a new relationship with the United States of America, and shifted power to the Commonwealth through legislation and taxation reform, and set the stage for our post-war immigration boom. Other than being the birthplace of Anzac, 1915 is a year pales in comparison to the influence of these events and these reforms on our nation's history. So to move back to some of the battlefield stuff. On the 7th of December 1941, Australia was not well prepared to defend herself. World War I was supposed to have been the war to end all wars, and the subsequent moves to limit armaments such as the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, as well as the impact of the Great Depression, had major effects on our interwar defence capabilities. The maintenance of Australia's military commitment to the system of imperial defence has seen, of course, at the start of the war in 1939, the majority of the AIF's infantry divisions deployed overseas, along with virtually all of the Royal Australian Navy and a large chunk of our air crews in the Royal Australian Air Force. Only the 8th Division was maintained to the Pacific. I'll plough on. With 2/3 of the division in Malaya and the rest split up in a desperate attempt to protect the islands to Australia's north, principally New Britain, Ambon and Timor. Home defence relied on a largely untrained militia, a few obsolete tanks and guns, and planes. Thus Australia found itself in a desperate situation in 1942. By the time bombs fell on Darwin on the 19th of February, Singapore had surrendered, much of the Dutch East Indies had been overrun, and the Japanese had occupied Rabaul. Soon after they were landing in New Guinea, and with the exception of a small force in Timor, the 8th Division went into captivity. With the Japanese holding air and sea supremacy throughout the Pacific, the US position in the Philippines would soon fall, and Australia was under threat of isolation. This brings me to one of the key issues that has resonated in relation to 1942, and this is the question of whether or not the Japanese were going to invade Australia. And to me, the evidence is clear on this. The Japanese had no intention of launching an invasion of our country. An invasion was not a part of their initial war planning, And once the Japanese finished their first stage operations and set about planning stage 2 operations, Australia was not on their list of invasion targets. Now this does not mean that it was not discussed, debated or considered by the Japanese High Command. A number of contingency plans were drawn up by the Japanese, and some elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy in particular seriously considered it. But the Japanese Army at the time was absolutely and totally opposed to any such scheme. They were embroiled in an exceptionally long continental war against mainland China. The Navy would struggle to provide adequate shipping to move the troops to Australia, and the Japanese Army was completely unwilling to allocate any more troops to what they saw as the Japanese Navy's war in the Pacific. If you want to have a good case study of how air forces and the navies and armies like to fight amongst each other, look at the way the Imperial Japanese attempted to fight the war in the Pacific. Basically, so the Navy saw the war of the Pacific as their war, and the Japanese Army as the war in China as their war, and they fought amongst each other almost as much as they fought with the Allies fighting this particular war. This, however, did not mean that the threat to Australia did not seem very real at the time. The attack on Darwin coincided with the Australian government's consideration of Churchill's request to send the 6th and 7th Australian Divisions to Burma, who were currently on their way. In fact, Churchill, as you probably well know, turned the ships around and then asked the Australian government's permission to do so. The Australian government also came under particular and considerable pressure from President Roosevelt of the United States, that Curtin demanded that those troops in that convoy be returned to Australia. It was to prove to be a wise decision, as these troops would go on to play a major role in the victories at Kokoda and Milne in Papua later in the year. In the following month, March, the Japanese decided their next stage of their plans. Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet, wanted to draw the US Pacific Fleet into the decisive battle as he saw it in the war, and this led to the Midway Campaign. In addition, the Japanese planned to take Port Moresby to protect their fleet base at Raval, and then to take a series of islands in the South Pacific to isolate Australia and cut her off from Hawaii and the United States. The battles fought from March to December 1942 were therefore not so much about the battle for Australia, as Curtin called them, but rather the battle for Australia's approaches. The Japanese hoped, somewhat fancifully, that by isolating Australia, we would withdraw from the war and become neutral. And my nice little map here sort of sees the different plans that the Japanese had. This is the one that they discussed and rejected, and of course the one they decided to actually undertake was this Operation FS and Operation MO, to isolate Australia from the Hawaiian Islands. The Japanese decision to isolate Australia led to a number of pivotal battles during the year. The first of these was the Battle of the Coral Sea, largely fought by the US and Japanese carrier groups, in fact being the first naval action where the belligerents never actually sighted each other. There was also an important role played by Task Force 44, which consisted of the RAN's cruisers Hobart and Australia, the US cruiser Chicago, and a number of destroyers and support vessels under the command of Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, with Australians serving in the Royal Navy. The aim of the Japanese was to land an amphibious force at Port Moresby in Papua. The American carriers fought a battle that was a tactical loss, in that they suffered greater loss of life and ships, but an important strategic victory was won. As mentioned, of course, the Americans and the task force took greater casualties, but they forced the Japanese aircraft carriers to withdraw. And with Task Force 44 blocking the access around the tip of Papua, the Japanese amphibious force was also withdrew. Port Moresby was thus saved. This gave the Allies in the Southwest Pacific some time to reform their forces, to reinforce Papua, to restructure the command setup and bolster Australia's defences. Under the terms of a new Allied command system, Australia became a part of the Southwest Pacific area under the command of US General Douglas Macarthur. Australia was repositioned as a major Allied base to support the defeat of Japan. And while balancing the arrival of Macarthur and thousands of Americans meant that the government in Australia had to balance the needs of self-reliance for our own defence, as well as the machinations of dealing with a new, great and powerful friend. In one of the most significant speeches of the year was Curtin's appeal to the Allies for support and his realisation that the British Empire in the Far East, or what we know as the Near North, was over. This meant that the country now had to, in the famous words of Curtin, turn to America. And this is often touted as a point of the formation of the alliance between Australia and the United States. However, a closer reading reveals a very different relationship between Australia and Macarthur. And I actually say this specifically, Australia and Macarthur, not necessarily Australia and the United States. And Macarthur, as the agent of the US government, was certainly very much in command. As Professor James Curtin, my friend and colleague from the University of Sydney, has noted in his wonderful book, Curtin's Empire, the PN spent the weeks after giving that particular speech backing away from that statement and under considerable public, media and parliamentary pressure to reaffirm our place in the British Empire and our ties to the mother country. Most significantly, the nature of our relationship with the Americans was revealed the day after the midget submarine raid on Sydney Harbour. At a meeting of the Prime Minister's War Conference, Macarthur told Curtin the following, and I quote, "Australia was a part of the British Empire, and it was related to Britain and the other dominions by ties of blood, sentiment and allegiance to the Crown. The United States was an ally whose aim it was to win the war, and it has no sovereign interest in the integrity of Australia. In the view of the strategical importance of Australia in the war with Japan, this course of military action would be followed irrespective of the American relationship to the people, whoever they might be, occupying the country of Australia." Macarthur was to be faithful to his words on this day throughout the war. And later on in 1944 and 45, when the battlefront moved away from Australia, Macarthur would relegate our national interest to a distant second as he undertook his personal crusade to liberate the Philippines. There was no ANZUS alliance until 1951, and of course it was not until 1964 that Australian strategic policy placed our relationship with the United States into the preeminent position in our defence policy. And of course, in the immediate period after the Second World War, we formed again close bonds and ties with the British Empire, of course fighting as a part of the British Commonwealth Division in Korea and fighting with the British in Malaya during the emergency and confrontation. Now this did not mean, however, that Australia was not crucial to US strategy in the Second World War in the Pacific. In fact, the major campaigns in 1944 in the Pacific were fought in the Papua and the South Pacific, precisely to ensure the security of Australia and New Zealand. In fact, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Navy, Admiral King, set two strategic priorities in the Pacific area for 1942. The first was the defence of Hawaii, and the second was the maintenance of a sea line of communication to Australia and New Zealand via the South Pacific. Despite Allied global strategy focusing on Germany first, King was determined to ensure that this would not be a passive defence, but rather an offensive one. So in order to defeat the Japanese drive in the South Pacific to isolate Australia, he launched his only trained amphibious division, the 1st Marines, and the bulk of his viable fleet at the time, his aircraft and logistical support into assault on the island of Guadalcanal. The sole aim of that operation was the security of Australia and New Zealand, and the development of these two countries, especially Australia, as a base to defeat the Japanese from during the war. While Macarthur had arrived and Australia was mobilising, the decision taken by the government for an all-out war effort made major changes to the home front. And this was a part of the government's move to encourage an all-in war effort that Curtin's speeches at this time of year 75 years ago was designed to inspire. These moves affected the role of women in the workforce and the domestic sphere, saw the introduction of widespread rationing and civilian defence measures. Thousands of Australians joined paramilitary organisations, and air raid precautions like the one you can see here behind me became a national priority for all civilians. The government formed a Department of Home Security, blackout restrictions were put in place, and air raid shelters were dug. Thousands of enemy aliens were interned in camps around Australia, and rationing was introduced widely throughout the country during this year. In two of the most significant moves, the government widened conscription in Australia and introduced the Manpower Directorate. All Australians aged over 16 years were registered, and civilian work and occupations were all regulated, while women's role in the workplace, as I mentioned, was transformed. By 1944, there were 855,000 women in paid labour in the Australian workforce, some 25% of the total workforce. Now, while relatively low in many respects, what is key here is the type of work that they are undertaking. Work that had traditionally been seen as male occupations before the war. And once this occurred, the pre-war majority of domestic occupations for women in the workforce ended forever in Australian society. The government also passed two critical pieces of legislation during the year. The first was the Statute of Westminster. It is often assumed that Australia had become an independent country at the time of Federation in 1901. However, the British government retained many prerogatives, including the complete control over Empire foreign policy. As such, when Menzies announced that Australia was at war in 1939, this was not due to any independent act of the Australian Parliament. In fact, when the Empire declared war, Australia automatically was at war too. In 1926, Australia had become a self-governing dominion in the British Commonwealth of Nations. And in 1931, the British Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster, establishing legislative equality for the self-governing dominions of the Empire. Australia, however, had failed to ratify the statute, and it took until October 1942 before it did so. Of course, backdating it to September 1939 and the declaration of war. This was a major and significant step along the road to Australia's full independence as a nation state. In addition, the government had to pay for these war measures, and this was a substantial financial problem for the nation at the time. And the government had to increase revenue. In order to do so, it looked at our state politicians and said that you had an unfortunate taxation system based on inefficient and ineffective measures. Treasurer Ben Chifley then introduced legislation in May of 1942 for the national takeover of income tax in Australia, something the government retained would be a temporary measure for the war. The states challenged this, of course, in the High Court and lost, and that meant in 1942 Australia also produced its modern federal tax system and form of government that they never handed back at the end of the war, and we still have today. I'm not sure if politicians want to take that up with the government in our discussions over federation. Of course, the other major event in Australia was the arrival of Macarthur and the US military. On the 17th of March 1942, General Douglas Macarthur had stepped, defeated but in his words triumphant, from a US Army Air Corps B-17 onto Batchelor Airfield just south of Darwin in northern Australia. While he'd been forced to retreat from the Philippines, he now stood ready to seek redemption by leading the US charge to victory in the Pacific. In true Macarthur style, he awarded each member of the plane's aircrew a Silver Star for saving him, inspected a ragtag honour guard that had been hastily organised, and then asked everyone around him where this powerful US Army he was about to inherit to return the Philippines was. Addressing a small knot of reporters who had gathered to greet him at the airfield, he stated the following: "The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Kokoda to Australia, for the purpose, as I understand it, of organising the American offensive against Japan, a primary objective which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through, and I shall return." Now, this statement is fascinating in that it reveals about Macarthur's intentions. He made no mention of Australia during his speech, other than the fact that the President had ordered him here. He paid no heed to the security or the defence of the nation in which he now found himself standing, and he spoke only of an American offensive rather than an Allied one for victory against Japan. Despite this initial bravado, Macarthur's confidence would soon be sapped as the realisation of the magnitude of his defeat in the Philippines would sink in. And on arrival in Adelaide a few days later, he was met by his Deputy Chief of Staff, Richard Marshall, who had flown on ahead. Marshall, of course, revealed that there was no US Army in Australia at the time awaiting the Great General. Rather, there were only some 25,000 US troops in the country, and there was not a single infantry rifleman amongst them. At this time, the US Army in Australia had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and its combat aircraft were largely obsolete and in poor condition. There was also little likelihood that large numbers of US combat units would be forthcoming anytime soon. It was therefore to Australia's military forces that Macarthur turned. Of course, this was compounded when he soon discovered that Australia had lost one of its few highly trained infantry divisions in Singapore and the islands to the north, that the remainder of the elite all-volunteer army was still in the Middle East and only just making its way home, and as were our Air Force squadrons and our Navy ships. And some of which, of course, would stay in the Middle East until well into 1943, particularly ships of the Navy, the 9th Division and parts of our Air Force. At home, what Macarthur discovered was a poorly trained and ill-equipped conscripted militia, most of whom have had no more than about 30 days training. It is also clear that his troops in Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines were doomed. As one author explained, Macarthur was dumbfounded. The colour drained from his face, his knees shook, his lips twitched, and for a long time he was unable to speak. When he finally gained control of his body and his emotions, all he could do was whisper hoarsely at those around him, "God have mercy on our soul." Now, despite Macarthur's claims soon thereafter that we had planned to dig in behind the Brisbane line, by that time there was no such plan in place, nor had there ever been a Brisbane line. When Macarthur arrived, the Australian General Thomas Blamey and his US predecessor George Brett had already drew up plans to move the bulk of Australia's military forces to northern Australia and into Papua to fight the Japanese. Macarthur, despite proclaiming in his memoirs that he removed this idea of a defence behind the Brisbane line, in fact accepted all of Blamey's advice and his strategic outline for the future plans for 1942. And of course, as the year progressed, the situation for the Allies slowly changed. Just as an offshoot, I'll just make the notion that if anyone knows much about Macarthur, he's kind of this sort of supreme egotist and narcissist, very much like the current President of the United States. I've actually had funny chuckling at myself what it would have been like if Macarthur had Twitter in 1942. It's just like Trump, he's a man completely obsessed with the media and completely obsessed with his own publicity. It would have been a fascinating thing. He actually controlled all the media and publicity press releases during his time as Commander-in-Chief. I can only imagine if he was able to tweet them out on the run as well, like our US President is. As I said though, as the year progressed, things for Macarthur and the Australians looked a lot better. Blamey had come back from the Middle East and been appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army and the Allied Land Forces Command. With the victories at Coral Sea and Midway and the expansion of the Australian military forces, Macarthur looked to establish a base on the northern side of the Owen Stanley Ranges around Boona, Gunner and Santander. He planned to establish a combined US-Australian force at Boona to build an airfield, to project air power into the Bismarck Sea, and of course protect the naval assets he planned to operate there. The Japanese, however, still with the initiative, beat him to the punch. Landing 2 weeks before Macarthur planned to get there in order to undertake an overland attack against Port Moresby. What is critical here is that their amphibious forces defeated, the Japanese were forced to fight a land campaign in Kokoda and Papua. And as the Allies lacked air or naval power to resist this, we had no option but to fight a bloody war of attrition along the Kokoda Trail. As July gave way to August, 3 important interconnected battles were fought: Kokoda, Milne Bay and Guadalcanal. As the Japanese advanced along the trail, they attempted to use a pincer movement by landing a force to capture Milne Bay, but lacking air superiority during the day, they were only able to land a small force that was eventually cut off and destroyed. While the victory on land at Milne Bay was significant, it only occurred because of the Allies' growing air and naval power while able to cut off the Japanese from supplies and reinforcements and allow them to be isolated and defeated in detail. Meanwhile, in the South Pacific, Admiral King's counter-offensive began with the landing of the Marines at Guadalcanal. And this, of course, led to the first major surface naval action in the theatre on the 9th of the 8th and 9th of August, where a number of Allied ships, including HMAS Canberra, were lost. This meant that within the space of less than 9 months, the RIN had lost the cruisers Sydney, Perth in the Dutch East Indies, and now Canberra, making 1942 the worst year in the RIN's history. The landing of the Marines had a major impact on the battles around Australia. It caused the Japanese to alter their plans and force them to delay their advance on Port Moresby over the Kokoda Trail. So while the diggers were securing a victory at Milne Bay and their comrades were forced to retreat from Isharaba, Major General Horry, the Japanese commander, was ordered over to the defensive until the Americans had been defeated at Guadalcanal. Horry was eventually lost his life as he tried to withdraw from the Owen Stanleys at the Battle for Oidigurari in November of 1942. This was proved to be the decisive battle in the Owen Stanleys and coincided with another significant Australian victory. This one on the other side of the world, where the 9th Division, still in North Africa, played a vital role at the Battle of El Alamein. Holding the northern end of the line against Rommel's panzers, General Moorehead's men made up only 1/10 of General Montgomery's 8th Army, yet took 22% of the casualties. This was to prove to be the decisive battle of the North African campaign. There was also a third important battle fought in November 1942, this one in Brisbane. The arrival of US personnel had initially been greeted with great enthusiasm in Australia, but as their presence became routine, tensions started to develop. From the highest level of the military to the lowest privates and sailors and airmen, cultural differences and one-upmanship had developed between the Australians and Americans. Incidents of poor relations between the US and Australian soldiers had multiplied, and they were particularly poor amongst the senior commanders. So much so, and so frequently did they bicker amongst themselves, that in November of 1942, the Secretary of Defence, Frederick Shedden, felt obliged to write to the Prime Minister John Curtin to appraise him of these events and raise his concerns about the poor nature of the relationships between mainly the Australian generals and the American generals. The Navy got on fabulously well, as navies often do, and the Air Force were getting along quite well too. The Army, however, they tended to bicker and fight amongst themselves bitterly. And tensions, of course, broke out amongst the soldiers on the streets of Brisbane on the 26th and 27th of November. And on the 26th, after a dispute between a drunken soldier and an American military policeman, about 100 Australian soldiers besieged the US Army Postal Exchange on the corner of Creek and Adelaide streets. Throwing rocks and bottles, the crowd began to grow and several fights broke out throughout the city. By 8 p.m, the disturbance had grown to some 5,000 people in Brisbane. At the PX, the MPs armed themselves with shotguns, which only further inflamed the situation. A scuffle broke out, shots were fired 3 times, an Australian artillery soldier was killed and 5 others wounded, as well as 2 civilians. By 10 p.m, the crowd dispersed, having left much of the American PX in complete and utter ruin. The following night, another crowd gathered and numerous scuffles between Australians and Americans broke out, and 8 US MPs and 4 officers were hospitalised. Now, the irony of this whole incident is that it actually started when an Australian soldier got involved themselves in an issue between a US Army private and a US Army military policeman. The Australian diggers believed that the US military police were heavy-handed, and they took exception when they took their batons out to bash one of the US doughboys. It was only after the death and injury of the Australian soldiers later on that night that the tenant took on the incident of an anti-US flavour. In reality, the riot broke out because it was an anti-military police riot rather than an anti-US one. Episodic disturbances would continue to occur in Australian cities and towns thereafter, but they were generally few and far between and on a very small scale. In particular, it should be noted that the relations between Australian and US servicemen were overwhelmingly harmonious. They shared similar outlooks on life, shared similar burdens and discomforts. This was particularly apparent the closer you got to the front line. General Blamey noted in response to the Battle of Brisbane, and I quote, "Strangely enough, as always, the nearer one gets to the actual battlefield, the better feeling we have. There is nothing here in Papua to indicate the curious outlook that has grown up in Queensland between the Australians and Americans." And as November turned to December 1942, the Allied successes in the air, sea and in the battles for Kokoda, Milne Bay and the beachheads at Boonagona and St Andrew and on Guadalcanal ensured the security of Australia. But these victories were only possible because of the preceding battles, that is, the air attacks around Leyde, Salamaran March, the Coral Sea and Midway. There are also a number of other important regional security operations for Australia, the most significant being the long campaign against the Japanese in Timor of that year. Timor's dense and inhospitable terrain aided the long guerrilla campaign. The early success of these operations was only made possible by the support of the Timorese people, who provided food and shelter, acted as guides and carriers, and helped set up ambushes and fought alongside the Australians. Many Timorese were brutally repressed by the Japanese, and a significant number were executed for helping the Australians. Maintaining a supply line to Timor was especially difficult, and this fell to the Royal Australian Navy and to the Dutch Navy, who ran the gauntlet of Japanese bombs through this period. And on the 23rd of September, HMAS Voyager went fast aground and was attacked by Japanese aircraft and had to be destroyed. And on the 1st of December, as we can see here, HMAS Armidale was sunk by Japanese air attacks while attempting to land Dutch troops as part of a relief operation for an Australian independent company. By year's end, the position in Timor was desperate and the decision had to be made to withdraw these troops, again putting the Navy at great peril in withdrawing them. In December, the second independent company and 190 Dutch troops were withdrawn, and by January, the last of the Australian troops were withdrawn by HMAS Arunta and the US submarine Gudgeon. What Timor illustrated was the critical importance of the local people to the success of Australia's military campaigns. To anyone at the battlefront, the importance of the local Timorese and the Papuans, both the logistic lifelines of Australians that kept them supplied, and also on the battlefront with their local knowledge and bush skills was omnipresent. Their sacrifice and endurance in the face of Japanese occupation and brutality should be remembered alongside the sacrifice of Australian servicemen and women. Timor also highlighted the importance of the role of the Dutch in the Southwest Pacific area. Now militarily weak, their role in the intelligence services, however, in this theatre were crucial, as well as in providing Air Force squadrons, naval ships and merchant ships in a critical component of our war. It was, after all, truly a coalition effort in our theatre during this time. So in conclusion, to draw it together, Australia's experiences in 1942 were just one small part of a global conflict. While the shadows of war merely touched Australia's shore, millions of people across the globe lived in the darkness that came with Nazi or Japanese occupation. Outside the Pacific, 1942 saw a number of crucial battles, such as El Alamein, which I mentioned before. Also, the Battle of the Atlantic continued to seesaw. In the Eastern Europe, where the bulk of the German military effort was directed, Hitler's forces suffered a devastating defeat in the Battle for Stalingrad that year. In 1942 also saw the Allied strategic bombing campaign in full force. And this, of course, included thousands of Australian RAAF personnel who served in this campaign through the Air Empire training scheme, something which I should note significantly retarded the Air Force's efforts to defend Australia during this year, as so many of its highly qualified and highly decorated pilots and bomber crew and ground personnel served on the other side of the globe in a different conflict. In the Pacific, of course, tens of thousands of Allied military personnel became prisoners of war of the Japanese, and hundreds of thousands of local people in the region suffered under their oppression. While in the Sino-Japanese War in China continued unabated, occupying the bulk of the Japanese army. Yet while the Second World War was global in nature, its ramifications were felt most significantly at the local level. Speaking in Parliament on the 27th of January 1943, Prime Minister Curtin reflected on what had been achieved during the year past. To save our country, he said, from invasion and to protect our own soil. These successes, he pointed out, were self-evident, because nowhere in Australia last night, he said, did people fear that air raid warnings would interrupt their slumber or their work. Victories at Coral Sea, Midway, Kokoda, Milne and Guadalcanal, and the beachheads have swung the balance in favour of the Pacific towards the Allies, and with Papua secure, Blamey and Macarthur will put forth their offensive plans for the reconquest of the South Pacific and the defeat of Japan. The country had emerged from the crisis of 1942 much stronger. The fledgling minority government had established itself, and the Prime Minister had emerged as a national leader. The government put in place major reforms to the wartime economy and reorientated Australian society to our war effort. The partnership with the United States was cemented, and crucial victories in the air, at sea and on land had been won. For Australia, 1942 was and will remain a pivotal year in our history, and it should continue to receive its due recognition in the crowded space that is the Australian memory and history of war. Thank you. Omnipresent. It was a personal crusade and a personal obsession. And that's why I actually separated the relationship with the United States from the relationship Australia had with Macarthur. So our relationship with the United States was through Macarthur, particularly at the military level, and he was obsessed with going back to the Philippines. He'd started planning from 1942 even though he was not directed to do so by the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was his command authority. But he worked assiduously towards that goal. Now, what he realised during 1942 was the security of Papua and setting up Australia as a base was going to be critical for that to happen into the future. And so at that stage, Macarthur's strategic interests, because I won't say America's, and Curtin and Australia's were in lockstep. And they worked in a very solid partnership in that year to do so. To my mind, that continued all the way through until about November of 1943. In November of 1943, which is after we assaulted Lae and Finschhafen and those areas in New Guinea. And up to that stage, the bulk of the Australian Army had been the bulk of Macarthur's ground forces. The Navy had been pretty much 50-50, or the bulk provided by our Navy. The Air Forces had always sort of been dominated by the Americans, so he's very militarily reliant on us. In November 42, however, we basically shot our bolt. We're exhausted. We've been at war since 1939. Now, the 9th Division had come back from Alamein and was now fighting in New Guinea. We were running out of people to do everything for war effort and stuff. And Macarthur was starting to get bulk US Army units. So they took over the sort of major campaigns for the advance along the north coast of New Guinea and through the Dutch East Indies. And thereafter, we never came back from that point. And we were sort of relegated to the second tier status, the smaller ally status. It was always going to happen because of the asymmetry in our relationship. But November 43 was that tipping point where the Americans took over. Thereafter, Macarthur showed almost no interest in us, except that the bulk of his logistics supplies came from Australia. So not his ammunition or his men, but his food, his things like everything from timber to his engineering supplies and all this type of stuff. So Macarthur was obsessed about keeping control of the Australian war effort so that it would actually support his military campaigns in the Philippines. And in fact, he only secured that when he basically did a secret deal with President Roosevelt. No one else was in the room and no one else knows what happened. Macarthur came out of that meeting in early 44 with the right to go back to the Philippines, and the rumour is the deal was that he agreed not to run for president later that year in return for being allowed to take the Philippines. It's just a rumour because the only two people who were ever in that room for that meeting was Roosevelt and Macarthur, and no one else knows what happened. So when our aims and his aims were in lockstep, it worked wonderfully well. When they started to diverge, we became second-class citizens to Macarthur. I'm a great admirer of General Blamey. He's a classic case of a great strategic thinker, a great army officer, and a completely flawed human being in combination. So was Macarthur, but for different reasons. So Blamey had a reputation for womanising, for drinking, and you know, with a teetotaling Prime Minister, he never really formed a good bond, even though he was the Prime Minister's supposedly senior military advisor. Of course, Curtin instead listened to Macarthur and Frederick Shedden, the Secretary of Defence, and Shedden was sort of in awe of Macarthur. He was completely blinded by Macarthur. Blamey was a very astute organiser of the army, a very astute strategic brain, and actually a very good operational commander. He was very poor at getting along with the soldiers. He often treated them very poorly, mainly because he didn't particularly think or care that his job was to be popular amongst the men. His job was to make the hard decisions that would make them a more capable force to get them to perform better on the battlefield. He was a fractious personality, which meant he argued with a lot of other generals. So there was sort of a lot of good points about Blamey, and the sort of personality issues are the things that kept him from having a good rapport with the troops. So unlike Morshead, for instance, who was very well revered by his soldiers, and General Basie as well. But they, I would argue, were not as good as operational and strategic level thinkers as Blamey was. So Blamey did wonderfully well, I think, in balancing the relationship with the Americans, of knowing when to push very hard Australia's national interests. You know, he does an amazing thing. Macarthur's bragging on our army and Air Force and stuff all the time, particularly the army in Papua, and claims that, you know, we're not doing a very good job. When the Americans go into battle at Buna and don't do very well, Blamey takes the opportunity, which is never good with a commanding officer, of rubbing salt into the wounds in front of a whole room of senior officers, and really hard, you know, and basically says, oh, that regiment of US soldiers you want to send me, I'm not going to take them. I prefer to send in the 21st Brigade, who are basically worn out, sick and at heartstrings, because at least I'll know they'll fight. and really sticks it to him. So he's very much a strong supporter of the army and a nationalist, but as I said, his personality problems means he fights with a number of other generals like Laverack and stuff. But for anyone who's been in the army, patronage networks always exist. People have favourite junior officers, there's senior officers who don't get along, and in wartime this is sort of exacerbated, So I think he inhibited the Australian Army in the sense that he didn't create an atmosphere amongst the men that gave him a lot of confidence in him because of his personality problems and the way he spoke to them at Kokoda. But leaving that aside, I think he was an exceptionally good commander. David Horner's biography of him, Blamey as a military commander, is exceptionally balanced and fair. And all the work I've done, I wrote a biography of his Chief of Staff and Chief of Operational Planning, General Berryman, who originally didn't get along with him very well, and then they formed a very close bond. And when you read what Berryman and a number of the other officers write about him as his tactical brain and his operational brain was wonderful. His personality was deeply forward, like many of us, I suppose. Yep, so the question was about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in 1943 and the importance of that. So obviously that happens early on in 1943, and that's one of the turning points in the campaign. As I mentioned, the reason we fight this bloody war of attrition on the Kokoda Trail is that neither side has air superiority or sea control. And without that, you can't, in a maritime environment in the islands of the Pacific, you can't use amphibious forces, and you can't get control, particularly the surface of the sea. Air superiority was absolutely critical to sea control on the surface. So when the Battle of the Bismarck Sea came along, so after the defeat of Bunagona and Sandana, the Japanese decided to reinforce New Guinea, and they sent a convoy of ships from about New Guinea carrying the better part of an infantry division. And the Air Force tried to stop it, and to their great embarrassment, they sunk one ship, and the rest got through completely unscathed. And Macarthur was livid, and the Air Force were horribly embarrassed by this. And the US Air Force Commander General Kenny took aside, and I could be wrong on this, but Bill Goering, from my memory, the group captain.
Yes.
Bill Goering and his senior bomber commander from the US, and put him in a room and said, you've got a week to figure out a plan how, when this happens next, because it will happen again in a couple of months' time, how this will never happen again. So they completely rearranged the doctrine and the tactical plans that they were going to do to defeat convoys. This is when they invented skip bombing. It's when the Americans invented the B-25s with all the cannons and the machine guns in the nose to be commerce destroyers. And then they practiced it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then when the next convoy came out a couple of months later, they absolutely obliterated it, and not one transport ship survived. And thereafter, the Japanese never had air superiority across the skies over Papua New Guinea for the rest of the war. They could get it in small episodes when they put all their air power into one area, but that meant from thereafter we could land the army in amphibious operations, because we actually had sea control. We could run convoys. One of the biggest problems in New Guinea is we couldn't run convoys around the north coast, because the Navy's charts came from 1862. The place is full of reefs, and we only had half a dozen destroyers to do it. And the naval commander's like, when you've got half a dozen destroyers in the whole theatre, you don't risk them sending them up where the Japanese have air superiority. But thereafter, we could have freedom of movement in the Bismarck Sea with our naval vessels, because we had the air superiority to support it. And it radically changed. There were no more Kokodas or Wales or Salamoas after that. They were a completely different set of campaigns. Censorship. It's wartime. The governments need to control the media, control the story, and control the population. I mean, Curtin has said, I don't necessarily agree with Curtin's statement of the Battle of Australia. I have a problem with that. But it doesn't mean it's not important. There was a battle for Australia's approaches, not necessarily a battle for Australia itself, which is, in my mind, just as important and doesn't, we detract from that anymore. But as he was using that rhetoric and that language to mobilise a country that had been reasonably complacent before that. I mean, Menzies in 1939, when we declared war through 40-41, fought a war of limited liability. It was like, at home, the economy was business as usual. The government hadn't decided until well into 1941 to actually start to ramp up. That the fall of Singapore, the Japanese attack, had been the catalyst point to to turn Australia into a mobilised country. We were one of the most mobilised countries in the world by the end of this war. And in fact, as I said, Macarthur relied on us statistically. Us and the New Zealanders are the only countries at the end of the Second World War that have a positive lend-lease balance. So lend-lease is where the Americans are lending or leasing industrial equipment, weapons and everything, money to other countries. Now the British are horribly in debt, the French are horribly in debt, just about everyone is except for us and the Kiwis. And we're so gracious, our government says to the Americans at the end of the war, don't worry old chap, you don't have to pay us back. We'll just scrub that debt for you and just leave it as it is. And this is because of the great effort we do at mobilising the country. And in fact, in the second half of the Pacific War in 44 and 45, our primary effort in defeating the Japanese was not actually on the battlefront as we fought in peripheral campaigns in Borneo or campaigns in New Guinea that were important in Australia's national interests, but not to the defeat of the Japanese in the war. Our major role in the defeating Japanese in the war was actually our war economy. And this is why so many troops are taken out of the services and put back into the economy in 1944 in the manpower crisis. You know, at the end of the war, we're producing our own fighter aircraft, our own bomber aircraft. The Navy's produced something like 60 corvettes and destroyers. We hadn't produced one single one before the war started. And in 1942, we weren't capable of doing that. Now we're churning out, you know, both fighters and Kitty Hawks and corvettes and, you know, all types of things. Now, HMAS Arunta, for instance, who has a fabulous career in the Navy, is an Australian-built ship. You know, one of the first and a very powerful asset. And that's because of the way the government motivates the civilian population for the war effort and mobilises the entire country. And I think, as much as the battlefront, that's as big an achievement of what we do. We go into the period after the war with a modern industrial base that we wouldn't have otherwise had. You know, now we're into how many years later we're into the debate over manufacturing industrial bases and whether they continued or not. But the one we had was very much the foundation of this was built during the Civil War effort. Of course, so early in the war there is Abder Command, the Australian, British, Dutch, American area, which is what the Singapore campaigns run out of. And that's the first ever attempt at a coalition joint combined headquarters in the theatre. It doesn't work overly well, but it sets the precedent for what becomes Macarthur's command, of course what becomes Eisenhower's command in Europe and the way they're structured and organised. And of course the Dutch lose significant naval forces in the Battle of the Java Sea and the Sunda Straits and other things like this. After that, the remaining Dutch forces in that area that were able to escape and didn't go into captivity, most of them were to Australia. So there are a number of Dutch Air Force squadrons that are formed that fly with the Allied Air Forces in the South West Pacific area. There's a number of Dutch merchant vessels in particular, and one of the greatest problems in the war, in the Second World War, was a shortage of merchant shipping. It's not sexy, and not a lot of people talk about it. But the greatest restriction on fighting our military operations in our theatre was a lack of merchant shipping. So we grabbed every Dutch merchant ship we could that was, you know, in the theatre and held onto them for grim death. And as I mentioned, what Macarthur did very well in terms of coalition stuff, he set up a very big intelligence network in the system. So most people have heard of the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. That all develops out of the Second World War. And when we develop ours, of course, the Dutch East Indies being such a significant part of it, a significant number of Dutch military personnel go into the intelligence services. And they provide all the information they have about the local knowledge about the terrain through Java, through Borneo, particularly when we get to attacking Borneo. We're also working with the Special Forces, the Z Special Force, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Service, the Allied Geographical and Spatial, I think I got that wrong, but the mapping and geographical terrain people. So, and of course, working in the headquarters and as the liaison between the Dutch government. I know the rest of the sort of Dutch forces, a number of them go back to Ceylon, as it was known in those days, and spend the rest of the war there preparing for the Dutch government to re-enter the Dutch East Indies at the end of the war. So the relationship is more at that political intelligence level with some key sort of forces down at the sort of, you know, aircraft, other, you know, Royal Dutch Air Force squadrons and those types of things. The greatest problem, of course, is they're cut off from your native country, so the ability to get, you know, reinforcements and personnel that continue when they take combat losses is very hard because you're under Nazi occupation. So it makes it very difficult for the Dutch forces. Yeah, so that was about the relationship between Australia and New Guinea and other South Pacific countries and the new President of the United States. So the other half of me, besides doing military operations in the Pacific and stuff, is I work on contemporary Australian-US alliance. I just had a book come out about that at the end of last year. In many respects, I'm as bamboozled as everybody else is. I've spent 15 years studying our alliance with the United States. I've lived there a number of times. I'm hoping to go back and live there for a number of months later this year. Going in April to speak to a number of my colleagues in Washington to try and get some more insight about the Trump phenomenon. But who knows? The one thing I think I would observe about the President of the United States is inside his White House there's two camps that are fighting for dominance. There is one camp that I would call the American nationalists, and that is his Chief of Staff, Steve Bannon, Conway, Kellyanne Conway and Miller and a few others. And they are the people, and the recently sacked National Security, or resigned National Security Advisor, General Flynn, they are the ones who are talking the anti-Islam language. They are the ones who are talking about building walls. They're the ones talking about tariff and trade wars and all this type of stuff. The other half is traditional Republicans. There's General Mattis, who's running Defence, Tillerson, who's running the State Department, and I'm forgetting his name now, but the former Marine General who's running the Department of Homeland Security and others. And what you have sitting on top of these two groups vying for influence and power, which will affect the way they view allies and the way they view the world, is a president that is completely unpredictable and no one knows who he's listening to. And that's the dangerous thing that's sitting on top of it. But apparently, if you like to play golf, and if you like to tell Donald Trump that he's the greatest president in the history of the United States and the greatest human being on the planet, he'll become your friend and your country will get out of it what you want. So instead of Malcolm talking about, refugee deals, which of course attacks the American nationalist group, he should probably be inviting him out for a game of golf with Greg Norman and telling him how wonderful he is. Because that seemed to work very well for the New Zealand Prime Minister, who did exactly that on his phone call. And he got an invitation to the White House. So, I mean, I literally think what we have is Narcissus as the President of the United States. Someone who is driven almost completely by narcissism. And, Narcissus fell into the pond and drowned in his own image. And my guess is that President Trump will fall from power by staring at the pond too long and falling into the water as well.